Let's make some ergonomic rocking chairs from scratch. So I made these for my parents for their new back porch so that they have a little place to relax that's nice and comfy. And I made them completely out of cedar because I want them to be really weather resistant and last a long time. So to get started, I bought some plans online that included some templates that they shipped to me, and it also told me how many pieces of wood I needed. So I first went out, got all those pieces of cedar, removed the staples, and then I started running them through my thickness planer to get them nice and smooth. I highly recommend having a thickness planer for this project because usually cedar is sold with one rough side and one smooth side, and it can take a lot of sanding otherwise to remove that roughness. But maybe you don't care about your cedar furniture having a rough side, in which case this might not be a problem for you. Now, if you do end up using a thickness planer, I do recommend using a dust separator like I have here. It connects to a 5-gallon bucket and separates dust as it goes to your shop vac. It prevents your shop vac from getting clogged as quickly and easily, and this is especially great if you're ever sanding drywall and there's lots of fine dust that clogs your filter. Get one of these. So once I had everything planed nice and smooth, I started making rough cuts to the length of the template pieces that I had, and this just made the cedar boards a little easier to work with. And the plans I purchased told me exactly what lengths I should cut these rough cuts to, so that made it nice and simple. Then at this point is when I realized that they sent me a bunch of templates, but there were 2 of one, and one of them is missing, and it was the back piece for the rocking chairs, which is very important. Thankfully, I've already built an ergonomic porch swing with very similar dimensions, so I was able to just go and recreate my own template for the back using that. And because I was able to make my own template, I did add in a little bit more lower back support because I noticed that the porch swing plans that I used didn't have that much lower back support, and that is something that bothers me. Once I finally had all my templates ready to go, then I traced all of them onto the pieces of wood that I'd pre-cut. With this, especially if you're like me and you were not able to find a lot of pieces without a ton of knots in them, I would recommend trying to find ways to place your templates on the pieces of wood where your cuts don't run through the knots, because what can happen as you cut through a knot is that part of the knot flies loose and then you have a missing chunk out of your piece, which is not ideal. So be a little strategic as you're marking where your cuts will be. Once I had everything traced out, then I started making my cuts. So first, because this is an ergonomic rocking chair, it has a ton of different slats on it that allow for all those curves. So I started by cutting out all the slats using my table saw. And then for my other template pieces that had long straight cuts, I also used my table saw to make sure those stayed nice and straight and perfect. Then for short straight cuts, I moved on to my miter saw, and I used a sacrificial piece of plywood underneath to prevent blowout and splintering. And I highly recommend that, especially if you want the back of your piece of wood to look a lot nicer, because cedar does splinter pretty easily in my experience. And then once I got all those short straight cuts done, I moved on to using my jigsaw for long curvy cuts. Now, if you don't want to buy all these saws, you can absolutely make all of these cuts just with a jigsaw, but for me it just makes things a little speedier since I already have these saws on hand. Then to make everything look beautiful and professional, I rounded all of the edges by using my router table and a 3/8 inch round over bit. I like to use this little table saw helper tool to make sure that I get to keep my hands away from the router bit as I'm passing things through. Once I had everything rounded, I still had to sand it, and this is a very dusty project and very tedious, but that's what happens when you're building ergonomic furniture. I sanded everything with 180 grit because I wanted it to be really nice and smooth as a finished piece. And then to make sure that it didn't get rough once I applied my stain, I did water pop everything and sand everything again, which is an annoying step, but I do think it's worth it if you want that super smooth professional finish. To save myself a little bit of effort on the staining process, I used a stain and sealant in one, and I used a product that can just be rubbed on rather than having to brush it on, wait a bit for it to penetrate, and then remove it. So this just made everything a lot easier. I applied 2 coats of it, and by the end, everything was waterproof. One mistake I made here is that I didn't wait long enough for the oil stain to dry before I applied my waterproof wood glue and started assembling things. So if you have time to wait before to let that oil stain dry a bit more before you start gluing things together, do that, or wait until your piece is completely assembled to stain everything, and that way it doesn't interfere with the wood glue. But I didn't decide to do that because I do find it's easier to pre-stain pieces rather than stain them at the end and trying to get in all these little tight nooks and crannies. But here I just followed the steps in my plans for how to assemble it. There were a lot of calls for just using brad nails and wood glue in the instructions, and I just didn't feel comfortable with just those pieces of support. So I put in a couple screws as well to make this extra secure. And then again, there were some parts of the assembly that just relied on some short screws. I again personally just didn't feel like that was secure enough to make me comfortable, so I added in some carriage bolts to make sure that everything felt really secure. And we'll get to that later. For any time I added in screws, I made sure to use a countersunk drill bit to make sure that the head of the screw sat flush with the surface of the wood and wasn't projecting out. And so that's also what I did to install all of the slats. And I cut 2 1/8-inch spacer pieces that I moved between the slats to make sure they were all evenly spaced. Now when it came time time to attach the legs to the assembled backs and seats. The instructions called for screws and I think maybe dowels, but I just decided instead that I would use carriage bolts because I like the look of it, and there's already carriage bolts that are used on the armrests as well. So if you haven't used them before, for carriage bolts, you want to drill all the way through your pieces of wood. Then you tap in the carriage bolt with a hammer, and then the square piece of the carriage bolt under the head is what provides a really secure connection. In order to tighten that down, you need to attach the washer and nut to the back, and ideally use a ratchet to tighten it down. And you can see that as you crank the ratchet, it pulls the square head of the bolt in and provides that really secure joint. Now, I'm not saying those instructions are wrong, especially if you're dealing with dry wood, unlike the oily wood that I was working with. Wood glue may be a lot sturdier for you, but personally, I just like strong hardware to be present instead of just wood glue and smaller fasteners. And here is how the rocking chairs turned out, and I think they're super comfy and practical, and I hope that my parents will love them. I do feel like the stain may just be a little too orange. I'm kind of thinking about making a little bit more brown. What do you think? Now that I have these built, I'm going to move back to fixing things on the porch, starting with the cracked concrete. I'm going to fill that and try to find a way to stain this whole thing and just make it look nice and brand new again.